Today's focus is going to be on MIDI. MIDI technology is basically a computer language. All right, so what we're dealing with is sort of a new technology that came out in the late 70s, early 80s that was adopted and basically allowed for music instruments to sort of connect or collaborate with computer programs. So you can imagine that with the onset of MIDI technology, that the music industry went through a shift. If you think of classic sort of 70s rock and roll music and what sort of took over in the 1980s, there's a lot of drum machines, there's a lot of synthesized sounds and things like that. So MIDI is sort of this new technology that came on the horizon and allowed for a whole new realm of possibilities, which additionally led to more flexibility in the recording of music and also the type of music that was being created. So if we break it down, MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And yeah, I've already mentioned that it's really sort of like this musical language, but really what it is information that is being provided traditionally by a keyboard controller of some kind. It's sending information to a computer, ones and zeros that then represent something that's going to be, it might trigger an instrument, it might give us information about like how long a note is to be held, like the sustain or the release, the sort of qualities of a sound. But really, if you look at the picture here and some of the different sort of images that you see represented, you may have seen some of these kind of things. The most traditional MIDI interface that I can think of is a keyboard. All right, but the MIDI information has nothing to do with specifically like the music language. That's oftentimes what it's representing, but it could represent a whole bunch of different things. For example, with the onset of programs like Ableton Live or something, you might see or be familiar with some, like the image in the upper left here, like a launch pad. It's really just a series of buttons that it's going to trigger, like that is assigned to particular things or sounds or sort of controller effects inside a computer program. And the MIDI technology is just triggering, like making a connection between this controller device and the software. So it's not uncommon to see MIDI controllers that are either keyboards, sure, but it could be a different instrument, like an electronic clarinet, say, that's going to won't work in the same way as a traditional clarinet, right? But that information about what pitch is being played, how long it's being played for, those kind of things would be, that information would be recorded using the MIDI language into a computer. But it could also be something like a mixing console almost, or just like a series of dials and knobs that can be associated then with different control parameters on an effects unit, on a virtual instrument, or whatever. So one of the big things that we use MIDI technology for is to play virtual instruments, right? Play or record performances that are then going to be associated with virtual instruments. So a virtual instrument, what is that exactly? It is a digital representation of the real instrument. So we're using synthesized sounds to create sounds that imitate real instruments and using MIDI controllers of whatever kind you choose to trigger those synthesized sounds. Now inside your digital audio workstation like Pro Tools or Logic Pro or something, you have a series of virtual instruments that come standard with that program. There's also going to be third-party vendors that strictly create virtual instruments, and they use MIDI technology to basically apply the keyboard, like the pitches and how long you're playing the notes and all that stuff, but they connect those with the synthesized sounds. So you can use a traditional looking MIDI keyboard to play a violin or a harp or any kind of drums, right? So there's all sorts of virtual instruments that exist, and we use MIDI technology and MIDI controllers to create or record performances with them. What's really interesting about virtual instruments is that because, again, they're these digital representations of real instruments, and the way that MIDI works is you're not actually recording, when you record MIDI, you're not actually recording any real sound. You're recording information that is applied to sort of this synthesized sound. So when you see MIDI notes being recorded into a digital audio workstation, it's not a waveform or anything like that. It's a vertical representation of a piano called a piano roll, and then just like a little block that says, well, how long was this pitch played for? How long should it sustain for? And then, of course, whatever virtual instrument is being applied to it will be what's represented auditorily. MIDI is also used for the purposes of sampling. So there's a difference between samples and virtual instruments. If virtual instruments are sort of synthesized imitations of real sounds and instruments that we're used to hearing, sampling takes existing audio and we can edit out little chunks of it and apply those samples to different keys on a MIDI controller, and then use the MIDI controller to play back those samples in interesting ways. For example, you could say there's a particular piece of a drum beat out of a famous hip hop song from the 1980s, and you really want to use that in some sort of modern production. Well, you can sample that piece digitally, right? Find a little chunk of that audio content that you like, and then you can edit it, warp it, do whatever you want, and then assign it to a particular key on the keyboard. And that works in a couple of different ways. One, you can just say, well, I want to assign this sample to all the keys on the keyboard, and depending on which key I hit, it will change its pitch, right? The higher up on the MIDI controller that you play, the higher pitched that same sample will sound. But what you can also do is say, well, actually, each key on my MIDI controller is going to be a different sample that is represented in different ways. So that you have lots of flexibility with this, but there is a definite difference between sampling and virtual instruments. We just use MIDI controllers and MIDI technology to include them in our music productions. MIDI is also used for parameter control. So here's an interesting looking MIDI interface, MIDI controller. It's just a series of knobs, and what we can do is assign any one of those particular knobs to control a specific parameter on either a virtual instrument, a sampler, or maybe even an audio processing tool within your digital audio workstation. For example, it's a pretty common modern music production technique to make adjustments to the high and low pass filters of an equalizer over time. Especially EDM artists or modern pop music uses this kind of function all the time. So what you can do is assign that low or high pass filter to a particular knob on a MIDI device such as this, and then you can adjust that while you're recording this MIDI information, and you can record those movements, those changes of the parameter controls over time. And of course, then you can go back and edit it, re-record it, whatever you need to do. But this allows for some really interesting flexibility in both performances and in recordings of virtual instruments, samplers, etc. Sequencing is the term that we give when we are creating entire productions out of MIDI information, right? So I might decide that I'm going to use a few different virtual instruments to create music, right? I might use a virtual grand piano, a violin, a drum machine, and a bass synthesizer, right? So the recordings that I make are going to turn into a sequence, meaning that they're going to be played back in sequence, right? Now, what's really awesome about MIDI technology is, yeah, you can record it using a controller device like a keyboard or some of the other controllers that we've talked about, but you can also just use a mouse and point and click onto a piano roll grid like what you're seeing in front of you. So you actually can effectively create a whole bunch of music using virtual instruments and samplers and all that kind of stuff, but without any real musical expertise. You don't need to know how to play the keyboard in order to sequence amazing MIDI compositions. You can just use your mouse and click around and by trial and error, create amazing sequences that turn into just awesome musical experiences. So there's some arguments out there, and this is an interesting conversation to have, but there are some arguments that say, well, MIDI technology has no place in music production and recording because it allows the flexibility for people that maybe have little to no musical experience to sort of enter that scene, right? But then there's the argument that, well, I should totally be allowed to sort of switch up how the music industry goes and insert myself into the music production world because I play the technology. I may not play the guitar like a virtuoso or something, but I play technology, and that certainly has shown over the years to be, only strengthening, right? There's all sorts of bedroom music producers that only use this type of recording method. They don't even have traditional recording equipment and microphones or musical experience, right? Just taking samples and creating sequences in really interesting ways. Finally, we can also use MIDI technology to take our sequences and flip that around and transcribe them into what is considered to be traditional musical notation. So most digital audio workstations have the ability to take a MIDI sequence and then churn out musical notation based on the sequence that you've provided. Also, those same programs will likely work in reverse. So if you're a composer and you only think in the terms of musical notation, you could very well use a mouse and create musical compositions using traditional notation like this, and then apply that MIDI information to a virtual instrument. Like let's just say that you wanted to score the music for a short film and you wanted to use traditional orchestral instruments, but you don't play those things and you don't have access to an orchestra. But you can use MIDI technology and write out the notes and then say, well, these notes should be applied to a cello and these ones should be applied to an oboe. And then you can create these compositions in reverse almost, because you're making the notation and then applying specific instruments, sounds, samples to the MIDI information that you've generated in that way. So there you have it. That's just scratching the surface on MIDI technology. Remember, musical instrument digital interface. This is really a whole world in and of itself. This could be an entire course learning more, diving into MIDI and knowing exactly what it can do. It's not just music related stuff, okay? You can use MIDI technology to trigger lights or pyrotechnics at a concert. So we really just scratched the surface here. So thanks for watching.